The chestnut mare's hooves had barely stopped echoing in the stable yard when Georgia Zimmerman realized something was terribly wrong. Her father's prized breeding horse, Starlight, was missing from her stall, and in her place stood a hastily scrawled note that made Georgia's blood run cold. The note said her father had lost the mare in a poker game at the Silver Dollar Saloon, but Georgia knew her father had been dead for 3 months, buried on the hill overlooking their ranch just outside Lincoln, Nebraska. Someone had forged his name, stolen her horse, and she intended to get Starlight back, even if it meant walking into that smoke-filled den of gamblers and thieves herself. It was late September in 1876, and the autumn winds carried the scent of dried prairie grass through the streets of Lincoln as Georgia marched toward the saloon with fury burning in her chest. She was 22 years old, running the horse breeding operation alone since her father's passing, and she had worked too hard to let some crooked card player steal her livelihood. Starlight was not just any horse. She was the foundation mare of their breeding program, worth more than everything else Georgia owned combined. Without her, the Zimmerman ranch would crumble into dust like so many other failed enterprises in Nebraska territory. The Silver Dollar Saloon squatted on the corner of Main Street like a painted lady showing too much ankle. Piano music drifted through the swinging doors, along with raucous laughter and the sharp smell of whiskey. Georgia had never set foot in the place. Respectable women did not, but she was past caring about respectability. She pushed through the doors and felt every eye in the room turn toward her. The piano player's fingers stumbled over the keys before falling silent. "Where is he?" Georgia demanded, her voice cutting through the sudden quiet. "Where is the man who claims he won my horse?" A thin man with slicked back hair and a fancy vest rose from a table in the corner. His smile was all teeth and no warmth. "I am Silas Crane, miss, and I won that fine mare fair and square from Jacob Zimmerman 3 nights ago. Got his signature right here on the deed of ownership." "My father has been dead for 3 months," Georgia said, her voice shaking with rage. "You are a liar and a thief, and I want my horse back." Silas Crane's smile never wavered. "Now, that's a serious accusation, miss. I have witnesses who saw your father at this very table. Perhaps you've been mistaken about the timing of his unfortunate demise." Georgia's hands clenched into fists. She knew what she was facing. This man had forged documents, probably bribed witnesses, and stolen her horse through legal-looking fraud. The local sheriff was his cousin. She had no recourse through the law, and Crane knew it. He was already walking toward the bar, dismissing her as if she were nothing more than a buzzing fly. "You have not heard the last of this," Georgia said, but even she could hear the desperation in her voice. She turned and walked out of the saloon, fighting back tears of frustration and fury. Outside, the September sun seemed too bright, too cheerful for the devastation crashing down on her. Without Starlight, she would have to sell the ranch within a year. The mare's foals had been her only reliable income. Georgia leaned against the hitching post, trying to think of what to do next, when she heard a deep voice beside her. That was brave, walking in there alone. She looked up and found herself staring at the broadest chest she had ever seen. The man was massive, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to block out the sun. He wore buckskin pants and a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt that strained across muscles built from years of hard mountain living. His hair was dark brown and fell past his shoulders, tied back with a leather cord. His face was weathered and strong-jawed, with a straight nose and eyes the color of pine forests. He looked like he could wrestle a bear and come out the winner. "Brave or foolish?" Georgia said, wiping at her eyes quickly. "I am not sure which." "Patrick Youngblood," the man said, touching the brim of his worn hat. "I could not help but overhear what happened in there. Silas Crane is a cheat and a liar, known for it all through the territory." "Georgia Zimmerman," she replied automatically. "And yes, he is, but knowing it and proving it are two different things. He has my horse, and I have no way to get her back." Patrick's eyes narrowed. "The chestnut mare with the white star on her forehead? I saw Crane leading her to the livery this morning. Beautiful animal. Knew something was wrong about how he had her. A man like that does not come by a horse like that, honestly. Can you help me?" The words burst out of Georgia before she could stop them. "I can pay you, not much, but I can offer you something. I cannot let him keep Starlight. She is everything I have left." Patrick studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He had come down from the mountains 2 days ago to trade furs and stock up on supplies before winter set in. He had been planning to head back to his cabin in the wilderness come morning, away from people and their complications. But something about this young woman's fierce determination struck a chord in him. She reminded him of a wounded hawk he had once found, still fighting even with a broken wing. "I am not much for taking money from people in need," Patrick said slowly. "But I do not like seeing thieves prosper. Tell me about this mare and how Crane got her." They moved away from the saloon to a quieter spot near the general store, and Georgia told him everything. About her father's death from a fever back in June, about struggling to keep the ranch going alone, about returning from checking the herd this morning to find Starlight gone and that forged note in her place. Patrick listened without interrupting, his face growing darker with each detail. "Crane probably watched your place, waited until you were gone, then stole the mare and forged the paperwork to cover his tracks," Patrick said when she finished. "The problem is, he has made it legal in the eyes of the law, corrupt as that is. You could fight it in court, but that would take months and cost more than you have." "So there is nothing I can do?" Georgia felt the hope draining out of her. "I did not say that." Patrick's smile was grim. "Crane fancies himself a gambler. What if someone were to win that mare back from him in a card game?" George's heart leaped. "Could you do that? Are you good at cards?" "I am fair," Patrick admitted. "Better than fair when I know the other man is cheating, and Crane will cheat. He always does. The trick is catching him at it in a way that cannot be denied." "When?" Georgia asked eagerly. "When can you try?" "Tonight," Patrick said. "Crane will be in the saloon again tonight. He's always there. But you need to understand something, Miss Zimmerman. If this goes wrong, it could get dangerous. Crane does not like losing, and he has friends who are not above violence." "I understand," Georgia said, though her stomach twisted with worry. "I trust you." It was a strange thing to say to a man she had just met, but somehow it felt true. There was something solid and dependable about Patrick Youngblood, something that made her believe he was the kind of man who kept his word. "There is one problem," Patrick said, rubbing his jaw thoughtfully. "I just spent most of my trading money on supplies. I do not have enough to match the stakes Crane will demand for a horse like that." George's mind raced. "I have some money saved, about $200. Would that be enough?" "It might be," Patrick said, "but Miss Zimmerman, you need to know you could lose it all. Gambling is always a risk, even when you know you are the better player." "It is a risk I have to take," Georgia said firmly. "Without Starlight, I will lose the ranch anyway. At least this way I have a fighting chance." Patrick nodded slowly. "All right then. Meet me back here at sunset. Bring the money and be prepared to wait. These games can take hours, and I will need you nearby in case anything goes wrong." "I will be here," Georgia promised. She spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of nervous energy, unable to focus on any of the dozen chores that needed doing back at the ranch. Instead, she cleaned out her father's old office, counting out the money she had scraped together from selling foals and doing odd jobs for neighboring ranches. $217. It represented months of work and sacrifice. She put it in a leather pouch and held it tight, praying she was making the right choice. As the sun began to paint the western sky in shades of orange and gold, Georgia rode back into Lincoln on her old gelding, Rusty. Patrick was waiting where he had promised, looking even more imposing in the fading light. He had cleaned up some, she noticed, though he still looked like exactly what he was, a mountain man more comfortable with wilderness than civilization. "I have the money," Georgia said, dismounting and handing him the pouch. Patrick weighed it in his hand, then tucked it into his vest. "You should find somewhere to wait nearby. The boarding house across the street has a porch where you can sit. If things go well, I will come get you when it's over. If things go badly, you should head back to your ranch and stay there until I send word." "What if something happens to you?" Georgia asked, suddenly afraid for him as well as for her horse. "I have been taking care of myself in rougher places than Lincoln, Nebraska," Patrick said with a slight smile. "But I appreciate the concern. Now go on. The sooner I get in there, the sooner we can resolve this." Georgia wanted to say more, wanted to thank him properly or warn him to be careful, but he was already walking toward the saloon with that steady, confident stride. She led Rusty to the boarding house and tied him up, then settled onto the porch in a rocking chair where she could watch the saloon doors. The wait was agony. Night fell completely, and the streets of Lincoln emptied as honest folks went home to their families. The saloon grew louder, more raucous. Twice, drunken men stumbled out and staggered away into the darkness. Once, she heard breaking glass and raised voices, and her heart nearly stopped. But no one came running out, and the noise inside eventually settled back to its normal chaos. Hours passed. Georgia's back ached from sitting tensely in the chair, and her hands were cramped from gripping the armrests too tight. She tried not to think about what might be happening inside, tried not to imagine Patrick losing, or worse, being discovered and attacked. She had dragged this stranger into her problems and put him in danger, all for a horse. What kind of person did that make her? But Starlight was not just a horse, she reminded herself fiercely. Starlight was her future, her father's legacy, her only chance at survival. She had to fight for that, even if it meant taking desperate risks. It was past midnight when the saloon doors finally swung open and Patrick emerged, leading Starlight by a rope halter. Georgia's heart soared. She jumped up from the rocking chair and ran across the street, hardly able to believe her eyes. "You did it!" she breathed, reaching out to stroke Starlight's soft nose. The mare nickered and pushed her head against Georgia's chest in recognition. "You actually did it." "We should go," Patrick said quietly, his eyes scanning the street. "Now. Crane is drunk and angry, and his friends are working on getting him more angry. I would rather not be here when they decide to do something about it." Georgia did not need to be told twice. She untied Rusty and swung into the saddle, and they headed out of town at a quick trot, Patrick leading Starlight alongside his own massive bay horse that he had retrieved from the livery. They did not speak until Lincoln's lights had faded behind them, and they were out on the dark prairie under a sky full of stars. "What happened?" Georgia finally asked. "Tell me everything," Patrick chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "Crane is not as good a cheat as he thinks he is. I watched him for the first hour, losing small pots intentionally while I figured out his system. He has a partner who signals him from across the room, and he keeps extra cards tucked in his sleeve. Once I knew his tricks, I waited for the right moment and suggested we raise the stakes. I put down your $200 and said I wanted a chance to win something worth real money. He laughed and said the only thing he had worth betting was a horse he had just won, worth at least $500. I acted like I was drunk and overconfident and said that sounded perfect to me." "But you only had 200, Georgia interrupted. "How did you make up the difference?" "I bet my rifle, my winter furs, and my saddle," Patrick said calmly. Together with the cash, it was enough to make him interested. "Then I made sure I won." "Made sure?" Georgia's voice rose. "You cheated too?" "I prefer to call it evening the odds," Patrick said with a hint of amusement. "When a man is already cheating, it is not really cheating to stop him from cheating, is it? I caught his extra cards before he could use them and exposed his partner's signals to the whole table. Crane could not back out without admitting he had been cheating all along, so he had to play the hand straight. And when the cards are fair, I am the better player." Georgia was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then she started to laugh. She could not help it. The relief, the joy, the sheer improbability of it all bubbled up inside her and came out in great gasps of laughter. Patrick joined in, his deep laugh rolling across the prairie. "Thank you," Georgia said when she could finally speak again. "Thank you so much. I do not know how I can ever repay you." "You already did," Patrick said. "You trusted me with your money and your horse. That is payment enough." They rode in comfortable silence for a while longer, until the outline of Georgia's ranch house appeared in the starlight. It was a modest place, a 2-story wooden structure with a barn and several corrals. Not much to look at, but it was home, and Georgia loved every weathered board. "You should stay the night," Georgia said as they approached. "It is too late to ride back to town, and you must be exhausted." Patrick hesitated. "I do not want to compromise your reputation, Miss Zimmerman. A single woman and a strange man under the same roof. People talk." "Let them talk," Georgia said firmly. "You saved my livelihood tonight. The least I can offer you is a bed and breakfast. There's a spare room upstairs that was my father's. You are welcome to it." Patrick could not argue with the practicality of that, and truthfully, he was tired. It had been a long, tense night. He helped Georgia settle the horses in the barn, making sure Starlight was comfortable in her familiar stall, then followed Georgia into the house. The interior was neat and clean, if sparsely furnished. Georgia lit a few lamps and warm light filled the main room. There was a stone fireplace, a worn sofa, a dining table with mismatched chairs, and shelves full of books. Patrick noticed the books with interest. Not many ranch houses had libraries. "My father loved to read," Georgia said, following his gaze. "He taught me to love it too. Those books are some of my most precious possessions." "A good inheritance," Patrick said. "Better than gold." Georgia showed him to the spare bedroom upstairs. It was simple but comfortable, with a real bed and clean sheets. Patrick could not remember the last time he had slept in an actual bed. His cabin in the mountains had a pallet of furs on the floor, and he had grown accustomed to it. "Thank you again," Georgia said from the doorway, "for everything. I still cannot quite believe you did all this for a stranger." "You are not a stranger anymore," Patrick said, meeting her eyes. "Friends help each other. That is how I see it." "Friends," Georgia repeated, a soft smile crossing her face. "I like that. Good night, Patrick." "Good night, Miss Zimmerman." "Georgia," she corrected. "Please, after tonight, I think we can use first names." "Georgia," Patrick agreed, and she left him to his rest. But Georgia could not sleep. She lay in her own bed across the hall, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. The events of the day played over and over in her head, and at the center of all of it was Patrick Youngblood. She had never met anyone like him. He was strong and capable, but also kind and honest. He had risked his own possessions and safety for her without asking for anything in return. And there was something else, something she was almost afraid to acknowledge. When she looked at him, she felt a flutter in her chest she had not experienced since she was a girl with her first crush. "Stop being foolish," she told herself sternly. "He is a mountain man passing through. He will be gone in the morning, back to his wilderness life, and you will never see him again. Do not start imagining things that cannot be." But her heart would not listen to reason. When morning came, Georgia rose early and made a large breakfast. Eggs from her chickens, bacon from the smokehouse, fresh bread she had baked the day before, and strong coffee. She was setting the table when Patrick came down the stairs, his hair still damp from washing at the basin upstairs. "That smells incredible," he said, and Georgia felt an absurd pleasure at the compliment. They ate together as the sun rose, painting the prairie in shades of amber and rose. Patrick talked about his life in the mountains, about trapping and hunting, about the solitude and beauty of the wilderness. Georgia talked about the ranch, about her dreams of building it into the finest horse breeding operation in Nebraska territory, about how much she missed her father, but how determined she was to honor his memory by making the ranch succeed. "You are very brave," Patrick said when she finished, "running this place alone, standing up to men like Crane. Your father would be proud." "I do not always feel brave," Georgia admitted. "Most of the time I feel terrified and overwhelmed. There's so much to do, so much I'm still learning. My father made it look easy, but it is not." "Nothing worth doing is easy," Patrick said, "but you are doing it anyway. That is what courage looks like." After breakfast, Patrick helped Georgia with the morning chores. He repaired a section of fence that had been sagging for weeks, fixed a loose board in the barn door, and helped her move hay bales that she had been struggling with alone. Georgia watched him work, fascinated by the easy strength in every movement. He made hard physical labor look effortless, and she found herself staring at the way his muscles moved under his shirt more than once. "I should head back to town," Patrick said finally, when the sun was high overhead. "I need to resupply and start back to the mountains before the weather turns." Georgia's heart sank, but she forced a smile. "Of course. You have your own life to get back to. I will walk you out." They went to the barn together, and Patrick saddled his bay horse in silence. Georgia searched desperately for something to say, some reason to make him stay a little longer, but she could not find the words. What right did she have to ask him to stay? He had already done so much for her. Patrick led his horse out into the yard and swung up into the saddle. He looked down at Georgia, and something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been regret. "If you ever need anything," he said slowly, "my cabin is 2 days' ride northwest of here, up in the Pine Ridge area. Anyone in that region can point you in the right direction. I am usually there from first snow until spring thaw." "I will remember that," Georgia said, her throat tight. "Thank you, Patrick, for everything." He nodded, touched the brim of his hat, and rode away. Georgia stood in the yard watching until he disappeared over the horizon, feeling like something precious had just slipped through her fingers. The next few weeks were busy ones. Autumn was deepening into winter, and there was endless work to do preparing the ranch for the cold months ahead. Georgia threw herself into the labor, trying not to think about Patrick Youngblood, trying not to remember the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled or the sound of his deep laugh. She told herself she was being ridiculous. They had spent barely a day together. It was not enough time to develop real feelings for someone. But telling herself that did not make the loneliness any easier to bear. Starlight, at least, was thriving. The mare had been briefly distressed by her ordeal, but settled quickly back into her familiar routines. Georgia checked her constantly, paranoid that something else might happen, but the days passed peacefully. Word had spread about how Patrick had exposed Silas Crane's cheating, and Crane had left town in disgrace. No one would bother Georgia now. The local ranchers, who had been quietly skeptical of a woman running an operation alone, started treating her with new respect. A few even stopped by to offer help if she needed it. November arrived with the first serious cold snap. Georgia was in the barn one morning, checking on Starlight and the other horses, when she noticed something that made her freeze in shock. Starlight was showing clear signs of being in foal. Georgia had not even considered the possibility, but now that she looked closely, it was obvious. The mare must have been bred before Crane stole her, probably by the fine stallion from the neighboring ranch that had gotten loose back in early summer. Georgia's hands shook as she examined the mare more carefully. Yes, definitely pregnant, probably about 4 or 5 months along. The foal would arrive in early spring. This changed everything. A foal from Starlight, especially if sired by that excellent stallion, would be worth a small fortune. It was the windfall Georgia desperately needed, the foundation for rebuilding her breeding program into something truly profitable. But it also meant Starlight would need special care through the winter, extra feed, close monitoring. Georgia was not sure she could manage it all alone. She spent the next few days in a state of anxious planning, calculating costs and feed supplies, trying to figure out how to make everything work. She was so preoccupied that she did not notice the rider approaching until he was already in the yard. When she looked up from the ledger she was reviewing and saw Patrick sitting on his bay horse, Georgia's heart nearly stopped. "Patrick?" She rushed out of the house, hardly able to believe her eyes. "What are you doing here? I thought you went back to the mountains." Patrick dismounted, and Georgia saw that he looked thinner, more weathered. "I did go back," he said. "Got all the way to my cabin, stocked it for winter, set my trap lines. Then I sat there for 3 days and could not stop thinking about you." Georgia's breath caught. "Thinking about me?" "I told myself I was being a fool," Patrick continued, his eyes fixed on hers. "That I barely knew you, that I had no business disrupting my life for a woman I had just met. But the truth is, Georgia, I have not been able to get you out of my head since the day I met you. The way you walked into that saloon alone, the way you fought for what was yours, the way you trusted me to help you. I kept thinking about your smile and your voice and the way you looked at sunrise. And I realized something." "What?" Georgia whispered. "I realized I did not want to spend another winter alone in those mountains. I realized I wanted to spend it here, with you, if you will have me. I do not have much to offer. I'm rough around the edges, and I'm not used to civilized living. But I'm strong and capable, and I promise I would work hard to help you build this ranch into everything you dream it could be. And maybe, if you feel even a fraction of what I feel, we could build something else too, something together." Georgia felt tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling so hard her cheeks hurt. "You came back," she said wonderingly. "You actually came back." "I could not stay away," Patrick said simply. "Georgia, I know it is fast and I know it is crazy, but I think I am falling in love with you. Have been since the moment I saw you standing up to Crane in that saloon. You are the strongest, bravest, most beautiful woman I have ever met, and I want the chance to prove I can be the kind of man who deserves you." Georgia closed the distance between them in 3 quick steps and threw her arms around his neck. Patrick caught her easily, his strong arms wrapping around her waist, and when their lips met, it felt like coming home. The kiss was sweet and fierce and full of promise, and when they finally broke apart, both of them were breathless. "I have been miserable since you left," Georgia confessed, her hands still linked behind his neck. "I kept telling myself I was being foolish, that I could not possibly have real feelings for you so quickly, but I could not stop thinking about you either. When I saw you riding up just now, I thought I might be dreaming." "Not a dream," Patrick said, kissing her again, softer this time. "I am really here, and I'm not going anywhere if you do not want me to." "I do not want you to," Georgia said firmly. "I want you to stay. I want you to help me with the ranch. I want to see where this goes between us. And Patrick, I have news. Starlight is in foal. She will deliver in spring, and I am going to need all the help I can get." Patrick's face lit up. "That is wonderful news. We will take care of her together. We will take care of everything together." Over the following weeks, Patrick settled into life on the ranch as if he had always belonged there. He was an incredibly hard worker, up before dawn and working until after dark, repairing everything that had fallen into disrepair, improving systems that had been merely functional, building new structures that the ranch desperately needed. He constructed a proper workshop, reinforced the barn, built additional corrals, and even started work on a second stable building for when the breeding program expanded. But more than his physical labor, Patrick brought a sense of partnership that Georgia had not realized she was missing. Every decision was discussed together, every plan made jointly. He valued her opinions and respected her knowledge of horses, while she relied on his practical experience and problem-solving skills. They made a good team, complementing each other's strengths and supporting each other's weaknesses. And through it all, their love grew deeper. Patrick courted Georgia properly, despite them living under the same roof. He had moved into the spare room and insisted on maintaining that separation until they could marry properly. He brought her wildflowers from the prairie, carved her small gifts from wood during the long winter evenings, and took her on rides across the land to show her the beauty of the territory through his mountain man's eyes. Georgia cooked his favorite meals, mended his clothes, and read to him from her father's books on the nights when they sat by the fire together. In late November, Patrick rode into Lincoln and returned with a simple gold band. He proposed to Georgia at sunset on the hill where her father was buried, asking both her and her father's memory for permission to marry her and promising to spend the rest of his life making her happy. Georgia said yes without hesitation, and they were married the following week in a simple ceremony at the small church in Lincoln. The winter that followed was the happiest time of Georgia's life. Being married to Patrick was everything she had hoped and more. He was gentle and passionate, protective but never controlling, strong but never harsh. They worked side by side during the day and fell asleep in each other's arms at night, and Georgia could not imagine how she had ever managed without him. As winter deepened, they spent more time inside, planning for the future. Patrick drew up designs for expanding the ranch, adding more pasture land, breeding facilities, and living quarters for hired hands they would eventually need. Georgia worked on a breeding plan, researching bloodlines and making contacts with other horse breeders across the territory. Together, they dreamed big, imagining a future where the Zimmerman Ranch, now the Youngblood Ranch, would be known throughout Nebraska and beyond for producing the finest horses in the West. Spring arrived slowly, grudgingly, but when it finally came, it transformed the prairie into a sea of green dotted with wildflowers. Starlight's time was approaching, and both Georgia and Patrick watched her closely. On a warm April evening, the mare went into labor. Georgia and Patrick stayed with her through the night, and just before dawn, a perfect chestnut colt was born. "He looks just like his mother," Georgia breathed, watching the foal struggle to his feet on wobbly legs. "He's going to be magnificent," Patrick agreed, his arm around Georgia's shoulders. "This is just the beginning. This foal, this ranch, our life together. It is all just beginning." Georgia leaned into her husband's solid strength and felt a contentment so deep it brought tears to her eyes. She thought about how everything had changed in less than a year, how she had gone from desperate and alone to happily married with a thriving ranch, how a crooked card game had led her to the love of her life. "I am so grateful," she whispered, "for all of it, even for Silas Crane stealing Starlight, because if he had not, I never would have met you." "I am grateful too," Patrick said, kissing the top of her head. "Every decision I made led me to you, and I would not change a single moment." As spring turned to summer, the ranch flourished. Word spread about the exceptional colt, now named Stardust, and buyers began approaching Georgia about future foals. Patrick proved to have an excellent eye for horses himself, and together they selected 2 more quality mares to add to the breeding program. They also purchased a young stallion with excellent bloodlines, carefully chosen to complement Starlight's qualities. The ranch's reputation grew, and with it, their prosperity. By summer's end, they had enough money to hire 2 ranch hands to help with the expanding operation. Georgia conducted the business side with sharp intelligence, negotiating prices and contracts, while Patrick managed the physical operation, training horses and overseeing the hands. But the greatest joy came in early autumn when Georgia realized she was pregnant. She told Patrick one evening after supper, and he lifted her clean off the ground in his excitement, spinning her around until she was dizzy and laughing. "A baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Georgia asked, though she could see the answer in his glowing face. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Patrick said, setting her down gently and placing his large hand over her still flat stomach. "You have given me everything I never knew I wanted. A home, a purpose, love, and now a family. I am the luckiest man alive." Georgia's pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter. Patrick was impossibly protective, wanting her to rest constantly, though Georgia insisted on staying involved in the ranch operations. They compromised, with her taking on less physical work while still managing the business and planning aspects. They used the quiet winter months to prepare the nursery, transforming a small room next to their bedroom into a cozy space for the baby. Their son was born on a bright May morning in 1878, 2 years after the night Georgia had walked into the Silver Dollar Saloon and set everything in motion. They named him Jacob Patrick Youngblood, honoring both Georgia's father and his own. Little Jacob had his mother's dark hair and his father's strong build, and both parents were instantly besotted. "He is perfect," Patrick whispered, holding his son for the first time with a gentleness that seemed impossible in such large, work-roughened hands. "He is ours," Georgia said, her heart overflowing. "Our family." Life settled into a new rhythm with a baby in the house. Patrick proved to be a devoted father, rising in the night to walk Jacob when he was fussy, playing with him endlessly, and talking to him constantly, even when the baby was too young to understand. Georgia nursed their son and watched her husband with him, falling even more deeply in love with Patrick as she saw the tenderness he showed their child. The ranch continued to thrive. Starlight produced another exceptional foal, this time a filly, and Stardust was developing into everything they had hoped. Other mares also foaled successfully, and the Youngblood Ranch was becoming known as a premier source for quality horses. They expanded their facilities again, building a larger barn and additional pasture land. As Jacob grew from infant to toddler, he showed a natural affinity for horses. Patrick would carry him out to the corrals, and the boy would squeal with delight at seeing the animals. By the time he was 2, he was already learning to ride, seated in front of his father on the gentle old gelding, Rusty. Georgia sometimes had to pinch herself to believe how much her life had changed. The struggling, desperate woman who had confronted Silas Crane in that saloon felt like a different person. She was confident now, successful, and most importantly, deeply loved. Patrick showed his devotion in 1,000 ways every day, from the coffee he brought her each morning to the way he still held her hand when they walked together in the evenings. When Jacob was 3, Georgia discovered she was pregnant again. Their daughter, Mary Grace Youngblood, was born in the spring of 1882. She was tiny and delicate where Jacob had been solid and sturdy, with blonde curls and green eyes that seemed to see everything. Patrick was completely wrapped around her little finger from the moment she was born. "2 perfect children," he said, watching Mary Grace sleep in her cradle while Jacob played nearby. "How did I get so fortunate?" "We both did," Georgia said, leaning against him. "Sometimes I think about that night I met you, how desperate I was, how lost. I thought getting Starlight back was the most important thing in the world." "It was important," Patrick said. "That mare was your livelihood." "But she was not the most important thing," Georgia continued. "You were. Finding you, falling in love with you, building this life together. That was what truly mattered. Starlight was just the reason we met. The rest was us choosing each other every day, over and over." Patrick kissed her softly. "And I will keep choosing you every day for the rest of our lives." As their children grew, So did the ranch. By 1885, they employed 6 ranch hands and had expanded to over 300 acres. The Youngblood Ranch was one of the most successful horse breeding operations in Nebraska, known for producing animals with excellent temperament, intelligence, and physical ability. George's business acumen and Patrick's training skills made them a formidable partnership. Jacob, now 7, was already showing talent as a horseman. He spent every possible moment in the barn, helping his father, learning to gentle young horses, and absorbing everything he could about the breeding program. Mary Grace, at 3, was quieter but no less horse-crazy, content to sit on the fence for hours watching the animals, naming each one, and making up elaborate stories about their adventures. Patrick had changed too over the years. He still had the strength and capability of a mountain man, but he had developed a polish that came from success and settled life. He wore good clothes now, conducted business with neighboring ranches and buyers from as far away as Kansas City and Denver, and was respected throughout the territory. But Georgia loved that underneath the successful rancher was still the man who had risked everything to help a desperate stranger, who valued honor and honesty above profit, and who could still make her laugh until she cried. One evening in late summer, after the children were in bed, Georgia and Patrick sat on the porch swing they had installed years ago, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. The air was warm and filled with the chirping of crickets, and in the distance they could hear horses nickering to each other in the pastures. "Do you ever miss it?" Georgia asked quietly. "The mountains, the solitude, your old life?" Patrick considered the question seriously, as he always did when she asked something important. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity," he admitted. "Life was straightforward up there. Hunt, trap, survive. But I do not miss being alone. I did not even realize how lonely I was until I met you and understood what I had been missing. This life, with you and the children and the ranch, is so much richer than anything I had before. I would not trade a single moment of it to go back." "Good," Georgia said, snuggling closer, "because I need you here. Not just for the ranch, though you are essential to that. I need you because you are my partner, my love, my best friend. You are everything to me." "And you are everything to me," Patrick replied. "You and Jacob and Mary Grace, you are my whole world." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the swing rocking gently. Then Patrick spoke again. "Do you remember the first time I saw you? Standing outside that saloon, trying not to cry, so fierce and brave and scared all at once?" "I remember thinking you were the biggest man I had ever seen," Georgia said with a laugh, "and wondering if you were going to help me or tell me I was being foolish." "I knew right then," Patrick said softly. "In that moment, I knew you were going to change my life. I did not know how, and I tried to fight it, but something in me recognized something in you. Like we were always meant to find each other, and that crooked card game and stolen horse was just fate's way of making sure we did." "I knew too," Georgia admitted. "Not consciously, but my heart knew. Why else would I have trusted you so completely? I gave you every dollar I had and asked you to risk yourself for me, and I was not even afraid. I just knew you would do right by me." "Always," Patrick promised, "for the rest of my life. I will always do right by you." The years continued to roll by in a blur of happiness and hard work. By 1890, the Youngblood Ranch had become one of the most prosperous in the territory. Jacob, now 12, was already handling many ranch responsibilities and showed every sign of being an even better horseman than his father. Mary Grace, at 8, was proving to have a remarkable gift for understanding horses, able to calm frightened animals and spot subtle signs of health problems before anyone else noticed. Georgia and Patrick had added one more child to their family, a son named Thomas, born in 1887 when Georgia was 33. Little Thomas was a perfect blend of both his parents, with Patrick's dark hair and George's sharp intelligence, and a sunny disposition all his own. Starlight was now an old mare, retired from breeding, spending her days in a special paddock near the house where she could be pampered and spoiled. She had given them 8 foals over her breeding career, each one contributing to the ranch's success. Stardust, her first foal, was now their premier breeding stallion, and his offspring were sought after across 3 states. Patrick was 42 now, his hair showing traces of silver, though he was still as strong and capable as ever. Georgia was 36, still beautiful, her face showing character and wisdom earned through years of hard work and love. They had built something remarkable together, not just a successful business, but a true partnership based on respect, trust, and deep affection. One autumn afternoon, a stranger rode up to the ranch. He was an official-looking man in a suit, and he asked to speak with Mrs. Youngblood about a legal matter. George's heart clenched with old fear. Had something from the past come back to haunt them? Some challenge to Starlight's ownership, or some other ghost of those desperate days? But the man's news was entirely different. He had been hired to track down Georgia Zimmerman Youngblood regarding an inheritance. A distant relative in Missouri, a great-uncle Georgia had never met, had passed away and left a surprising bequest to his brother's granddaughter, the only family member who had shown enough backbone to run a ranch alone despite all obstacles. The inheritance was substantial, over $5,000. Georgia was stunned. Patrick, who had come in from the barn when he saw the stranger, was equally shocked. After the man left with promises to return with the necessary papers, they sat at the kitchen table staring at each other. $5,000, Georgia said faintly. I cannot believe it. Your great-uncle was right about one thing, Patrick said. You did show backbone, running this place alone before I showed up. You have more courage than any 10 men I know. What should we do with it? Georgia asked. We are comfortable now. We do not need it for the ranch. Patrick thought for a moment. What about a school? There are more families settling in this area every year, and the nearest school is over 10 miles away. We have the land. We could build a proper schoolhouse, hire a teacher, and give all the children in this region a chance at education. George's eyes lit up. That is perfect. My father always said education was the key to building a better future. He would love knowing his family's money went to helping children learn. Over the next year, they built the schoolhouse, a beautiful structure with large windows for light, proper desks, and shelves for books that Georgia stocked generously from her inheritance. They hired a young teacher from back east, a woman named Sarah, who was thrilled at the opportunity to teach in the West. The school opened in the fall of 1891 and served children from all the surrounding ranches, including Jacob, Mary Grace, and Thomas. The Youngblood School, as it came to be known, became a source of pride for the entire community. Parents were grateful for the opportunity to educate their children without sending them far away, and the school became a gathering place for social events and community meetings. Georgia served on the school board and was known for her fierce advocacy for educational quality. As the new century approached, the Youngblood Ranch was approaching its 25th year under Patrick and Georgia's management. They had weathered droughts and harsh winters, economic downturns and personal challenges, but they had survived and thrived through it all. Their children were growing into fine young adults. The ranch was more successful than ever, and their love had only deepened with time. On their 20th wedding anniversary in November 1897, Patrick surprised Georgia with a trip. He arranged for the ranch hands and Jacob, who was now 19 and more than capable of managing things, to handle the operation for 2 weeks. Then he took Georgia on a journey north into the mountains where he had once lived. It was Georgia's first time seeing the wilderness that had shaped Patrick. They rode for days through forests of pine and aspen, climbed mountain trails with breathtaking views, and finally reached the area where Patrick's old cabin had once stood. The structure had long since collapsed, reclaimed by nature, but the spot was still beautiful, a small clearing beside a crystal-clear stream with mountains rising on all sides. "This is where you lived?" Georgia asked, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "It is magnificent." "It was lonely," Patrick said simply. "Beautiful, but lonely. I'm glad I left. I'm glad I found my way to you." They camped there for 3 days, just the two of them, under the stars. Patrick taught Georgia to fish in the mountain streams and showed her how to track animals through the forest. Georgia told him stories of her childhood, memories she had never shared before. They made love under the open sky and talked until late each night, rediscovering each other away from the responsibilities and demands of daily life. "Thank you for this," Georgia said on their last night in the mountains, nestled in Patrick's arms, "for showing me this part of your past, for these days together. I needed this reminder of why we fell in love. Not that I'd forgotten, but life gets so busy sometimes." "I needed it too," Patrick admitted. I love our life, but you are right. We get caught up in the day-to-day and forget to just be together. We should do this more often. Take time for just us. Once a year, Georgia proposed. Every year we take a trip, just the two of us, and remember what matters most. Deal, Patrick agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss. They returned to the ranch refreshed and reconnected, ready to face whatever challenges and joys the future would bring. And there were many of both. Jacob married a sweet young woman from a neighboring ranch in 1899 and brought her home to the Youngblood Ranch, where they built a house on the property and began their own family. Mary Grace proved to have her mother's head for business and began taking over more of the ranch's administrative work, freeing Georgia to focus on other interests, including expanding the school and advocating for women's property rights in the state legislature. Thomas, the youngest, proved to be more interested in veterinary medicine than ranching. Patrick and Georgia supported his ambitions, sending him to study in Kansas City and being immensely proud when he returned as a trained veterinarian, opening a practice that served the ranches and farms throughout the region. As Patrick and Georgia entered their 50s, they gradually turned more of the ranch's daily operations over to Jacob and Mary Grace, while remaining actively involved in decision-making and planning. They had earned the right to slow down a bit, to enjoy their grandchildren, of which there were now 4, with more on the way. They still took their annual trips together, sometimes returning to the mountains, sometimes exploring other parts of the West, always carving out that precious time for just the two of them. One evening in the spring of 1905, Georgia and Patrick sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. Georgia was 60 now. Her dark hair shot through with silver, but her spirit as fierce as ever. Patrick was 62, moving a bit slower than in his youth, but still strong and capable. They watched the sunset together, holding hands, comfortable in the silence that came from knowing each other completely. If you could go back, Georgia said suddenly, back to that day in 1876 when we met, would you change anything? Patrick considered the question seriously. I would get there sooner, he said finally, spare you even those few hours of worry and fear. But no, I would not change how we met or what we have built. Every challenge made us stronger. Every hardship brought us closer. This life we have made together, it is exactly what I would choose, over and over again. Me too, Georgia said softly. I used to think the worst day of my life was when my father died. Then when Crane stole Starlight, I thought that was my lowest point. But those things led me to you, so I cannot even regret them. They were necessary steps on the path to everything good in my life. Starlight led us to each other, Patrick said, looking out toward the paddocks where the old mare had finally passed peacefully 2 years ago, after a long and happy retirement. She was more than just a horse. She was fate intervening. I wish I could thank her, Georgia said, tears gathering in her eyes, for being worth fighting for giving us the foals that built our success, for being the reason our paths crossed. I think she knew, Patrick said gently. Animals understand love, and that mare knew she was loved by both of us. They sat together as the stars came out, one by one, filling the vast Nebraska sky. Inside the house, they could hear laughter as their children and grandchildren gathered for dinner. The ranch that Georgia had nearly lost was now a thriving, multi-generational operation. The desperate young woman and the lonely mountain man had built something that would outlast them both, a legacy of love and hard work that would continue through their children and their children's children. As they finally rose to join their family inside, Patrick pulled Georgia close one more time. I love you, he said, as he had said thousands of times over their nearly 30 years together. Today, tomorrow, and always. And I love you, Georgia replied, the words as true and deep as the first time she had said them. Thank you for winning my horse back. Thank you for returning her to me. Thank you for staying and building this life with me. Thank you for everything. They walked inside together, hand in hand, ready to share a meal with the family they had created and the life they had built from nothing but courage, determination, and a love that had started with a crooked card game and a borrowed horse. It was not how anyone would have predicted their story would begin, but it was exactly how it was meant to be. Years continued to pass, marked by the changing of seasons and the growth of family. By 1910, Patrick and Georgia had 8 grandchildren, with 2 more on the way. The Youngblood Ranch now spanned over 1,000 acres and employed 15 hands. They had diversified beyond just horse breeding, adding cattle operations and agricultural production to ensure the ranch's long-term sustainability. But despite their success and the busy household always filled with children and activity, Patrick and Georgia never lost sight of what mattered most: each other. They still stole moments alone, still took their annual trips, still sat on the porch swing in the evenings talking about everything and nothing. Their love had evolved from the passionate intensity of new romance into something deeper and more enduring, a partnership so complete they could communicate with just a glance. Patrick's hair was completely silver now, and he moved with the careful deliberation of a man feeling his years, though his mind was as sharp as ever. Georgia had developed arthritis in her hands that sometimes made writing difficult, but she remained actively involved in the ranch's business decisions and her various community projects. They were growing old together, exactly as they had always planned. In the summer of 1912, the entire family gathered to celebrate Patrick and Georgia's 35th wedding anniversary. All three of their children were there with their spouses and children. The youngest grandchild was just 6 months old, while the oldest was already 13. The house overflowed with noise and laughter and love. After dinner, as the sun began to set, Jacob called for everyone's attention. "I want to propose a toast," he said, raising his glass, "to my parents, who taught me everything I know about love, dedication, and building something lasting. You two met in the most unlikely way, under the worst circumstances, but you chose to see possibility instead of just problems. You chose each other every day for 35 years, and you built something remarkable. Not just this ranch, though that is certainly impressive. You built a family rooted in love and respect. You built a community where education and fairness matter. You built a partnership that everyone who knows you admires and tries to emulate. So here is to Patrick and Georgia Youngblood, the best parents and grandparents anyone could hope for." "To Patrick and Georgia!" everyone chorused, raising their glasses. Georgia had tears streaming down her face, and Patrick's eyes were suspiciously bright. They stood together, acknowledging the toast, and Patrick cleared his throat to speak. "Thank you all for being here," he said, his deep voice carrying easily through the crowd. 35 years ago, I was a lonely mountain man with no family and no purpose beyond simple survival. Then I met Georgia, and everything changed. She gave me a reason to be better, to build instead of just exist, to love instead of just endure. Every good thing in my life comes from her. Our children, this ranch, this family we have built together. So while you are toasting us, I want to make my own toast to Georgia specifically. To my wife, my partner, my heart. Thank you for trusting a rough stranger all those years ago. Thank you for seeing past the surface to the man I wanted to be. Thank you for 35 years of love and laughter and adventure. You are everything to me, now and always." Georgia could not speak through her tears, so she just kissed him while everyone cheered. It was a perfect moment, surrounded by the family they had created, celebrating the love that had started in such an improbable way. That winter was harsh, with heavy snows and bitter cold. Patrick, who had always seemed invincible to Georgia, caught a bad cold in January that developed into pneumonia. For several frightening weeks, Georgia sat by his bedside, holding his hand, praying he would recover. Thomas used all his medical knowledge to treat his father, and slowly, gradually, Patrick began to improve. By March, he was back on his feet, though weaker than before. Georgia fussed over him constantly, making sure he did not overwork, insisting he rest more. Patrick complained good-naturedly about being treated like an invalid, but he secretly loved her attention and care. The illness had scared both of them, a reminder that they were not immortal, that their time together, however long it lasted, was precious. "We need to make sure everything's in order," Georgia said one evening that spring, when Patrick was nearly back to his full strength. When we're gone. The ranch, our wishes, everything." "Always practical," Patrick said with a fond smile. "But you are right. Let us make sure the children know exactly what we want." They spent several weeks putting their affairs in order, working with a lawyer to create detailed wills and succession plans. The ranch would go primarily to Jacob, who would continue running it, but with generous provisions for Mary Grace and Thomas as well. They also established a trust to ensure the school they had built would continue operating even after they were gone, with funds for maintenance and teacher salaries guaranteed for at least 50 years. There, Georgia said when everything was finalized. Now I can stop worrying about what happens next. Nothing is going to happen for a long time yet, Patrick insisted. We have years left together. I am not ready to leave you, and I am not giving the universe permission to take you from me either. Deal, Georgia said. We will both stick around as long as possible. And they did. Against all odds and the increasing frailty that came with age, Patrick and Georgia celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary in 1917. By then, they had 12 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren. The Youngblood Ranch had become an institution in Nebraska, and Patrick and Georgia were regarded as pioneers who had helped shape the region's development. They moved slower now, their bodies betraying them more frequently, but their minds remained sharp and their love undiminished. On warm days, they still sat on the porch swing together, though now they needed help getting there and back. They still told each other stories, still laughed at shared jokes, still reached for each other's hands across whatever distance separated them. One evening in late September 1918, as the first hints of autumn color touched the trees, Georgia and Patrick sat together watching the sunset. It had been 42 years since the night they met, and Georgia was thinking about how much had changed since then. Do you remember how scared I was that night? She asked, standing outside the saloon, not knowing what to do. I remember thinking you were the most courageous person I had ever seen, Patrick replied, walking in there alone, demanding what was yours. I was terrified. Being brave does not mean you are not scared, it means you do it anyway. Georgia squeezed his hand. I'm not scared anymore, not of anything, because I know that whatever happens, we will face it together. Together, Patrick agreed. Always together. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. In the barn, they could hear horses nickering to each other, the distant descendants of Starlight and Stardust. In the house behind them, they could hear their family moving about, preparing dinner, living their lives in the home Patrick and Georgia had built. If I could go back and tell that frightened girl outside the saloon how it would all turn out, Georgia said softly, I would tell her not to worry. I would tell her that the big scary mountain man is actually going to be the love of her life. I would tell her that losing Starlight was the best thing that could have happened, because it led to finding something so much more valuable. I would tell her that sometimes the worst moments lead to the best outcomes, and that love can appear when you least expect it, in the form of a stranger willing to risk everything to help you. And if I could tell that mountain man sitting alone in his cabin, trying to convince himself to head back north and forget about the woman with fire in her eyes, Patrick said, I would tell him to stop being a fool and go back to her immediately. I would tell him that she is his destiny, his purpose, his future. I would tell him that choosing her will be the best decision he ever makes, and that every day with her will be a gift he never imagined deserving. We were lucky, Georgia said. We were blessed, Patrick corrected, by fate, by timing, by a stolen horse that brought us together. But we were also smart enough to recognize what we had and brave enough to fight for it. As the stars began to appear overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their first night together and all the nights since, Georgia leaned her head on Patrick's shoulder and felt a contentment so complete it was almost overwhelming. They had lived a full life together, raised a beautiful family, built something lasting and valuable. They had loved each other well and truly, through good times and hard times, through youth and now into old age. And it all started because a gambler won her horse in a crooked card game, and a mountain man won it back and returned it to her stable, along with his heart. That was the story they would tell their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the tale of how Georgia and Patrick found each other. It was a story about courage and justice, about fate and choice, about love appearing in unexpected places and transforming everything it touched. It was their story, and it was perfect exactly as it had unfolded. Georgia and Patrick lived to celebrate their 45th wedding anniversary in 1922, surrounded by an even larger family. They both passed peacefully in their sleep within weeks of each other in the winter of 1923, as if neither could bear to live without the other. They were buried side by side on the hill overlooking the ranch, near George's father, in the land they had loved and worked and built into something magnificent. The Youngblood Ranch continued to thrive for generations after them, operated by their descendants who never forgot the lessons Patrick and Georgia had taught: work hard, love deeply, fight for what is right, and never underestimate the power of choosing the right partner. And every generation heard the story of how it all began, with a stolen horse, a crooked card game, and a mountain man who gave his heart along with returning a chestnut mare to her rightful owner. It was a love story for the ages, born in the Wild West, forged through hardship and determination, and lasting until death and beyond. It was the kind of love that people write songs about, that becomes legend, that reminds everyone who hears it that true love does exist, and when you find it, you should hold on with everything you have. And that is exactly what Georgia and Patrick did, from that first improbable meeting in 1876 until their final peaceful rest nearly 50 years later. They held on to each other, to their love, to their commitment, and they built a life that was everything either of them could have dreamed, and more. Their story ended as all good love stories should, with a lifetime of happiness, a legacy that endured, and two souls who found in each other exactly what they needed to become complete. From a crooked card game and a stolen horse to a love that lasted through the decades and shaped the lives of countless descendants, Patrick and Georgia Youngblood proved that sometimes the worst circumstances can lead to the best outcomes, and that true love really can conquer all. The end.